Thank you. So I'm Maryna Hrymych, and this is my pilot version of the biggest project on anthropology of war. I already have one book on anthropology of war. It's a case study, Divizia Галичина. It was published, I suppose, 10 years ago. And besides that, I am a member of International Ukrainian, Poland, and Luxembourg Academic Board of documenting everydayness of war, and it is a huge project. But today I will focus on the digital representation of grief. According to the North America academic tradition of presentations, I, before discussing the announced topic, want to state here how I had come about in choosing my specific research topic. For the last 6 years, I'm constantly observing and monitoring the Ukrainian segment of social media from the point of view of communicative partners in diasporas and groups of expats. And this topic belonged to my prime research interest. After February 24, Ukrainian social media crucially changed in terms of content, and I started to collect new materials which are relevant to my professional orientation as a folklorist and anthropologist. And I did it by default, you know, it is some sort of professional deformation. But during the first months it was just collecting, gathering data, very nervous and almost unconscious, just accumulating different Facebook posts through copy-pasting and screenshot doing. To be sincere, I had no intentions or physical energy to analyze them. As many of us, I was devastated. The event which motivated me to start my research was a roundtable discussion of the ethnography of war, articulating research needs in times of unfolding trauma, which took place on April 4, 2022, by the way, on my birthday. It was organized by Kule Chair of Ukrainian Culture and Ethnography and Kule Folklore Centre. I chose a very sensitive topic which I present today. It is a small pilot virtual ethnography conducted during February-October 2022 among Facebook users within my personal friendship network who, as I knew, to have recently experienced a loss. Secondly, I worked upon a set of memorial groups and memorial pages. And finally, there is a big amount of shared content. I would consider this presentation to be my personal grief for all deceased in this war. And some explanations on the title and used terms. By the phrase grief narrative, I will consider verbal and non-verbal texts by the means of which people grieve. Verbal texts that would be digital obituaries, death announcements, narrative mourning, and of course storytelling. The term non-verbal texts includes images, signs, infographic resources, icons, avatars, etc. By the phrase mourning practices, I mean verbal and non-verbal behavior of Facebook users in the communicative space of burial commemorative rituals and events. They lament, pray, memorialize the deceased in memorial accounts, and even create for them digital afterlife. By the word new, I lay down the time frame starting February 24, 2022 until today, and take to account social media. That would be the reflection of grief and mourning in Facebook. In one word, Facebook as a place of grieving. As it was marked in the introduction to the book Digital Death, a confluence of factors contributes to Facebook becoming the default destination for many to express grief and remember the deceased. The chosen topic, as almost everything in the modern academic discourse, is interdisciplinary one. In my pilot research, I would rely on or refer to opinion of experts in North American digital studies, namely digital death studies and digital folklore. Today I will use the quotations of Christopher Moorman, David Lewis, Candy Ken, Erich Tillman. Ukrainian folklore and folk life studies, namely folk laments, Irina Koval-Fuchilo, folk thanatology. I was an editor and one of the authors of the big project study Смерть Шанування померлих, and of course the newest studies of Maidan folklore. My favorite author is Lyudmila Ivannikova. Also I am aware of Natalia Bezborodova's thesis. And finally, verbal art studies, mainly genre of obituary and storytelling grieving practice. So you already noticed my position in defining folklore. It is based on American Society of Folklore viewpoint. It's clear when you go through ethnographic thesaurus, and also folklore as a subdivision of lore, traditional knowledge, and together with folklore gives a space with heritage, tradition, continuity, and transmitting. Speaking on Facebook post, we mean all of its subdivisions or parts: verbal text, a message, original or shared content; non-verbal message, image, video, multiple elements of design; emotional reactions, comments with infographic, signs and GIFs. Body of the grieving post usually contains either death notice or commemorative notice, obituary or condolences. As you know, death notice is an announcement that gives the name of the person who died and details of the funeral or memorial service and where donations can be made. You see here прощання з розвідником таким-то, Павлом Романенком, нікнейм Білі Кандагар, відбудеться тоді-то, там-то, у Павла залишилась дружина та маленька донечка, реквізити для допомоги такі-то. As you know, obituary is defined as a notice of a personal death, usually with a short biographical account. The Facebook digital obituary is pretty similar to non-digital, but unlike the classical genre with a strict structure, beginning and closure, and very formal language, the digital Facebook obituary loses many formal features and official language patterns and gets closer to the story. And the whole process of grieving frequently emerges to storytelling. Integral part of the Facebook story is a photo, which sometimes tells much more about the dead than words. In this case, we are dealing with visual remembrance. In this slide, the author of the story or obituary points out: "Сьогодні я хочу, щоб всі побачили фото цього хлопця." Looking at this photo involuntarily, the passage from Ukrainian голосіння pops into a head. А твої ж такі оченьки великі, блакитні, а тепер не глянеш, не поглянеш, а як же я буду без тебе? By the means of these non-verbal texts, selecting these heartwarming and heartbreaking photos, people want to compensate the absence of needed words, impossibility to express their loss and grief by the means of words. But sometimes we find really wonderful posts which demonstrate different types of storytelling and verbal art. In the middle, Максим вривався в моє життя як буревій і зникав, щоб знову з'явитись із якоюсь божевільною ідеєю. Ми познайомились, коли він працював двірником в Нацмузеї історії. In these words and in this picture in the middle, a character of the guy who was involved in very important cultural projects, but ignored any official position. That's why worked as a yard cleaner. Down. Ти хуліганьо і бешкетник, 100 кіло любові та ніжності, бойовик, сука. Куди ж, блін, ти зараз перевівся? На той світ? You hooligan and mischief maker. 100 kilos of love and tenderness. Where do you serve now? In the other world? As Candy Ken said in her article, tweeting death, posting photos and pinning memorials, this fuzzy line between private and public is what is perhaps most difficult about this new form of visual remembrance. While some find comfort in remembrance through posting pictures of the dead, others are disturbed and haunted by it. In many Facebook grieving posts, a non-verbal message, mostly photo, plays the role of the principal source of the information about a person, and verbal part of a post serves explanatory function. The author of this post underlines the фотка про Бодю, left side. У ній для мене весь Стефанишин, красивий та смішний, такий живий та справжній. And another photo, заслужений артист України, соліст Національного театру опери та балету Олександр Шаповал, and his two photo images, as a ballet dancer and as a soldier. The informative non-verbal message is based on contrast before and after. It could be also interpreted as alive and dead. Heartbreaking, isn't it? Meet Yulia Zhdanovska, fantastic mathematical talent. At the picture she's 21 and she'll always be 21. This is an example of very touching story written by the Taras Shevchenko University professor of mathematics about his student who was not only a brilliant mathematician, but at the same time a very warm and cheerful girl, as this photo vividly demonstrates. Yulia Zhdanovska passed away in Kharkiv during artillery shelling. Well, all these categories, obituary, death notice, storytelling, verbal and non-verbal grieving, visual remembrance, existed in Facebook space a long time before the war. Dealing with the death, each person has his or her own unique experience. At the same time, it is shared universal truth. But the aim, it was the quotation, but the aim of this modest pilot research is to find out what are the new features of death posts which appeared in wartime. There it is. Nickname as appendix to a name. Burial as a mission which is impossible. Oversized digital graveyard. All the deceased are treated like heroes. The slogan, lest we forget, becomes overgrown with the clause, won't forgive, will revenge, goddamn. And finally, some new rights, or rather a new shape of old rights. Let's go through all of them. As I mentioned earlier, unlike the obituaries and death announcements in peaceful times, in times of this war we get acquainted not only with the names of deceased, but as well with their nicknames. Here in Before we met a scout Billy Kandagar. At this post there are heroes with nicknames Chibi, Sticky, Piston. Of course, this anthroponymic tradition has started on Facebook as early as 2014, but it was not wide scale. And now there are thousands of nicknames on Facebook wall. Burial as a mission which impossible. Here is a case of my friend and daughter of our colleague ethnologist Valentina Borisenko. Olga Chernilevska's son and Valentina Borisenko's grandson, as hundreds of other Ukrainian soldiers and officers, was killed in Donetsk steppe. Relatives are not able to bury their sons, brothers, fathers, and so on, as their bodies left on so-called непідконтрольних територіях. She writes, Ольга, дорогі мої, ви питаєте, коли можна буде попрощатися з моїм Іллею. Страшна і гірка правда в тому, що син досі лежить в окопах, де його вбили. Останнє, що я можу зробити для сина, це добитися евакуації, ДНК-експертизи, перевезти в Київ останки і поховати, пише вона. І тоді ми зможемо попрощатися з Ільком. А до того, пише вона, я не знаю Бога. She says in another post, поховати сина – це моє єдине бажання. Чи могла я подумати, що колись напишу такі страшні слова? To bury a son, father, brother, sister, husband is the only wish of many people who have lost their loved ones in this war. They are waiting when the territory will be deoccupied, when he or her remains will be found, evacuated when DNA examination is done, and finally bury them. 2 days ago, I double-checked Olga's Facebook account and found out that, unfortunately, her wish is still not become true. In this situation, for many people, Facebook turns to only a place for grieving. Моя стрічка – це суцільний некролог. My timeline is an entire obituary, якщо я правильно переклала, writes Facebook user. Моя теж, my as well, comments another person. Enemy turns my timeline in martyrology, writes another Facebook user. As one of the digital death researchers, Ari Stillman says, unlike a cemetery, a virtual memorial is accessible via online connectivity at all hours of the day and night. That is the third point regarding the issue of what's new on Facebook, a quantity of the death posts. One can notice a certain algorithm of appearance death posts on Facebook wall, which should be explored separately. During these almost 8 months, these 8 months, there was new bursts. There was few bursts of mourning activity and few deceased when people get tired of sad news and try to avoid them. But what is stable is a conscious stream of new infographic and GIF resources which satisfy requirements of Facebook users. And this is a huge work of digital designers, or how they call themselves, digital death designers. Infographics, symbols, signs, images, pictures spread like a virus. Also, Facebook satisfies needs of users in mourning through offering options to create memorial accounts, which became the places where they can mourn. Usually, people keep the old account of their loved ones and post on a dead user's profile. Quotation, interacting with deceased users' Facebook wall is compared to attending a funeral. Facebook affords numerous ways to interact with the deceased wall. Some additional moments in the grieving practices became distinctive. No matter how the person passed away, he or she is named by the word hero. The phrase "Герої не вмирають," as you know, was one of Maidan slogans. A lot of new expressions containing a word hero appeared in mourning narrative. They remarkably enrich the vocabulary of war aphorisms. Here are some of them. Герої не вмирають, вони просто покидають поле битви, щоб оберігати свою родину на небесах. Герої не вмирають, вони живуть у наших серцях, у нашій пам'яті, у наших діяннях на славу України і нашого роду. A few more novelties of the grieving narrative. Traditional expression, we will not forget, lest we forget, extended with the phrase, we will not forgive. Обстріляли цивільний автомобіль, який віз допомогу, обстріляли прицільно. Ми не забудемо сміливу і добру Анастасію і не пробачимо виродкам її смерті. A civilian car carrying aid was fired upon. We will not forget the brave and kind Anastasia, and we will not forgive the bastards for her death. Сьогодні вночі загинула наша Катя. Ніколи не пробачу вам орки. Our Katya died tonight. I will never forgive you, orcs. Цьому хлопчику 18 років. Його чиста ангельська душа відлетіла в вирій до царства духа предків рідних. Не пробачимо і не забудемо ніколи. His pure angelic soul flew to paradise, to the kingdom of the spirit of our ancestors. We will never forgive and we will never forget. The leitmotif of revenge becomes an integral part of digital obituaries, grieving stories, and grief narrative. This Facebook post shares a story about two brothers who were killed at once. Не пробачимо ніколи, ми помстимося за вас, наші побратими. Two brothers, two fathers, two warriors We will never forgive, we will take revenge for you, our brothers. Damnation frequently escorts Facebook war posts. This young journalist was killed in her Kyiv downtown apartment as a consequence of missile attack. Горіть у пеклі прокляті фашистські орки. Burn in hell, you damn fascist orcs. While listening to the quotations or reading on the screen what I have omitted in my oral speech, you already noticed that the hate speech is full of obscene lexicon. Загинув мій брат, 4 дітей, я цих руками душити буду. Не знаю, чи я можу таке писати. Йобана русня перетворює мою стрічку на мартиролог. Take a look, the author camouflages the word йобана for not to be, I'm a scientist, researcher, excuse me, not to be identified or qualified by Facebook as a dirty language. I would say that the hate speech on Facebook during the last 8 months, I beg my pardon if I look now like a cynic, it is a high potential subject for folklore and linguistic studies with a number of research opportunities. It is a very creative practice, and what is important for folklorists, it is transmittable. This young woman is a widow in her 25. She curses enemies for unborn children for the stolen life. Я проклинаю этих фашистов, мою жизнь украла кучая Россия. A few words on the new offline rites, rituals and practices. Like in other times of war, natural disasters and genocides, наприклад, Голодомор, there is a big number of burials, graves placed out of the cemeteries. But what is new? A car license plates instead of a cross. You know the tragedy of Bucha and Irpin, when hundreds of cars, while evacuating civil population, were executed by shooting. So dead relatives are being searched by the numbers of car license plates. And something else, something new in a burial commemorative rituals. Residents of villages, towns and even big cities meet their deceased compatriots kneeling on the roadside. And finally, I'll focus on the folklore patterns, reminiscences and in a way intonations of the new Greek verbal narrative. And let's start a video.
Приходить вечір, приходить темно, всі лягають спати, а ти лягаєш і думаєш, от мислі мої в голові. Я лежу зараз під одіялом, в теплій кроваті, а моя дитина на полі лежить, а там холодно, а він змерз. І це отако, і це цілу ніч.
I repeat. Увечері, коли стає темно, всі лягають спати, от ти лягаєш і думаєш. І от мислі у моїй голові. Я лежу зараз під одіялом, в теплій кроваті, а моя дитина на полі лежить. А там холодно, а він змерз, і це отако цілу ніч. What do we have in this short text? If we compare it to the traditional forms of lamenting, we find out that recitative form is absent, and traditional word combination patterns couldn't be found. But still there is a strong association with folklore. And answering the question why, we point out first of all the traditional opposition between here in this world and there in other world, or at least on the way to other world. According to this young woman, her son still is able to feel, and now he experiences an after-death life. He is cold and being alone, not buried in the battlefield. Compared to the traditional Ukrainian lament. Чого ж ти собі таку хаточку забажала, хоч темну, невеселу, холодну. Там ні віконця, ні дверей, туди ні вітерець не провіє, ні праведне сонечко не прогріє. Да люди ж усі радуються, а ти що собрався, да там же й темненько, да там же й холодно, невидненько. While the shell is removed from the body of the text, one can see a well-known folklore ideology. This is an example of oral text, and now let's switch to text appeared in the written form. Наступний, так. Unlike most of the obituaries and stories, this type of Facebook post is not third person, but the first person type story. The author is directly addressing to the dead. Sometimes obituaries do contain in the last sentence a vocative form. Instead of нехай йому земля буде пухом, нехай тобі земля буде пухом. Спочивай з миром, братику. But still, it is just a small component of the text. The communicative strategy here is based on the addressing to the relatives and friends of the deceased, and even to the wider public, who are the target audience for storytelling and messaging. Whereas the folk mourning process is focused on communication with the dead. One more notice. Frequently Facebook users, while lamenting and addressing directly to the dead, use diminutives. And this is again folklore poetic language. She writes, дитино моя рідна, моя гордість, мій позитивчик, не пробачу себе, що не змогла тебе відговорити від того контракту. Наступним. In this slide you can see almost the classical folkloric lamenting strategy and poetic language. Дорога, люба наша дитиночко, де ти? Де зотліло тілечко твоє? Господи, дай нам можливість хоч кісточку поховати, могилку зробити, пам'ятничок поставити і приходити до тебе. Наступне. Usually folkloric grieving or lamenting speech contains kinship terms. Here is the example of addressing to a father. Тату, таточку, татусі рідний наш. Татусю, вибач, що так рідко тобі про це казала, про любов, пробач. Наступне, добре якраз. And what happens to some Facebook posts, the lamenting and storytelling are overlapping. Let's take a look on this example. The fiancée tells her own story, which contains the folklore lament strategy in terms of communicating to the deceased, and focusing on the traditional ritual item of funeral clothes, black kerchief. А потім була невідомість. До останнього я не знала, чи привезуть шматки твого тіла в закритій труні, чи все ж зможу востаннє на тебе глянути. Навесні ми планували повінчатися і відгуляти пишне весілля. Війна змінила наші плани. І замість розкішної фати моя мама одягла на мене чорну хустку. And instead of a bridal veil, my mother covered me with black kerchief. Compare to голосіння. А ти ж мене на вік посмутив, надів на мене чорну хустку на вік. Наступне. Black kerchief appears as well in war amateur poetry, which is also the integral part of Facebook grieving narrative. In these naive verses, a deceased son begs for mercy and seeks forgiveness for the black kerchief which his mother is ought to wear. Мамочко, вибач за чорну хустину, за те, що віднині будеш сама. Тебе я любив і люблю Україну, вона, як і ти, була в мене одна. And some conclusions. 20 years ago we would use a term folklorism, but friend De Caro, who was a folklore professor at Louisiana State University, invented a new term which he used in the title of his book, Folklore Recycled. He explains that folklore becomes transmuted and transported into other non-folk context, artistic, intellectual, and otherwise. And these are the principal statements I wanted to share with you today regarding a pilot version of the research New Grief Narrative and Mourning Practices in the social media, Ukrainian social media. Дякую за увагу.